On this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, we take a look at the television series' first episode, The Case of the Restless Redhead. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. The goal is to do a pod for every episode of the television series that ran from 1957 to 1966, and, if time permits, to cover some of those made-for-TV movies from the 80s and 90s too. Now, what are my qualifications? Well, I grew up in a house where "fire up a Perry" was a routine phrase, and I've been watching the show since I was 11. I remember specifically being homesick while WGN and TBS were celebrating the show's 35th anniversary in 1992 and falling in love with Mason, Della Street, Paul Drake, and even the law enforcement officials. I was always a Trag fan. Soon I was hooked on Earl Stanley Gardner's novels, and I've never looked back. Since then, I've watched and rewatched the shows and read and reread the novels during my downtime from my professional gig, teaching literature to college students. Perry still has a loyal following, but as I looked for podcasts for fans, all I was able to locate were serialized versions of the Mason radio adaptation aired in the 1950s. So here is an attempt to give Perry fans another way of interacting with their favorite fictional lawyer. The format of the show is going to remain consistent. I'll work through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and I'll compare changes to the novel the episode was based on, if in fact it was based on a novel. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme and go in depth on a key feature of each episode. We'll finish with a big takeaway, a Perry proverb, if you will. I'm really excited. I hope you are too. Let's get rockin' and rollin'. In this first episode, The Case of the Restless Redhead, which originally aired in September of 1957, we meet Evelyn Bagby, played by Whitney Blake. She is a put-upon woman whose distinguishing characteristics are physical, red hair and blue eyes.
Maybe you'd better forget about me, Mr. Mason. Forget about those big blue eyes.
And then, too, you have red hair.
After getting bilked by a would-be Hollywood agent, Harry Merrill, who we never see, very interesting, she's found herself falsely accused of stealing jewels from a Hollywood star, Helene Chaney, and now in possession of a gun that's not hers as the episode opens. She immediately calls on our intrepid hero, Perry Mason.
Hello? Yes? Evelyn Bagby? Oh, what does she want? All right, put her on.
And on her way to meet Mason that night, she encounters a driver who nearly pushes her off the road. In terror, she fires wildly with the gun she's found. And you know what happens next. Later that night, someone is found dead with a pillowcase over his head at the bottom of a ravine with a bullet in his head. We know Evelyn is telling the truth, and Mason believes her enough to do some legwork.
Miss Bagby?
Come in, Lieutenant.
Well, looks like old home week.
Yes, doesn't it? However, I wasn't aware there was a law forbidding an attorney from seeing his client.
Or maybe I can do something about it next session of the legislature.
And confuse the ballistics efforts of the cops. He, of course, uncovers the real motive for murder, blackmail money, and then he gets the real murderer to confess on the stand.
I killed him. I could get the money. Could get the money and get away from her. I wanted to get her off my back for 25 years. I'd do anything to get away from her.
Did Mrs. Bowles have anything to do with the murder?
No. I did it alone. I killed him in that apartment I rented. I figured it out all by myself. All she was worried about was the stinking motel getting a bad reputation. She always said I was dumb. Called me stupid. And I got $10,000, that's what.
The case is solved. Mason and Evelyn Bagby get a hefty paycheck from Mervyn Aldrich, the fiancé of Helene Chaney. Along the way, we get to meet Della, the confidential secretary of Mason, played admirably by Barbara Hill, who was only 25 when this episode first aired.
It isn't Della Street. What took you so long?
It's 1:15. We never close.
We've got William Hopper, who plays Paul Drake, Mason's crack private detective.
Perry, for the love of Pete.
Paul, I've got a gun here I want you to trace.
On the opposite side, we have Arthur Tragg, the lieutenant who's consistently trying to get Mason's client, portrayed by Ray Collins. He is the Drake to Mason's nemesis, Hamilton Berger, the prosecutor, the DA, who is played by William Tallman.
I'll object to that, Your Honor. Defense counsel is not only assuming a fact not in evidence, he's attempting to cross-examine his own witness.
Like most of the episodes from Season 1, this one is based on a novel by Earl Stanley Gardner. Now, while the murderer and murderer are the same, there are a lot of subtle differences that might help you see what kind of writer Earl Stanley Gardner was and what the real burden was for writers on the show. First, there's the structure that's different. Every television episode begins with the future defendant or the basic situation into which Perry intervenes. Perry only becomes part of the show after the audience knows the other characters. In the novel, Gardner always begins with Mason, or typically begins with Mason. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, Gardner begins with Mason in Mason's office. Number one, the novel is super complicated and features characters that don't appear in the show. The Hollywood star Helene Chaney, the one who actually got married to the deceased Harry in the books, his name is Steve, has a good friend named Irene Keith who is there to show us Mason's shrewdness and the complicated motives of the people who might be murderers. And Irene Keith is nowhere in the television show. Then there's the murderer himself. In the novel, his name is Harry Bowles. In the show, his name is Louis Bowles. And in the novel, he's a good time hang and a long-time pal of the deceased, Harry Merrill, Steve Merrill in the novel, who enlists two other characters who get cut out in the television adaptation because he wants Merrill's blackmail money, the money that Merrill gets from Hollywood star Helene Chaney. In the television show, Bowles is a hotel operator who desperately wants to get away from his wife, and he performs the murder almost to spite the deceased because the deceased, Harry Merrill, has called him stupid. So, one of the things going back and reading the novel, especially when you compare it with this first episode, is give you a lot of admiration for the TV writers because they streamlined this plot to a T. A lot of the things that are in Gardner's original novel don't necessarily have to be there. Another thing the novel does, it gives us a purpose for the title. Listen to this quotation from Evelyn Bagby in her discussion with Mason. Quote, "I was always restless. I never wanted to stay in one place. I keep roaming the country, so I finally asked myself, why not see Hollywood after all? So I made it." Now, one of the problems with TV, there's not enough time for characterization. So this backstory, this explanation of why exactly the redhead is restless gets cut out of the show. And all that's left really is Bagby's red hair. Now it's time for some trivia. Each week I'll give you 3 takeaways, and I've dubbed my 3 pieces of trivia Paul, an investigative fact, something worth looking more into, Adela, something that's about character, and then Perry, something that's associated with the character of Mason. Our Paul is a subject worth investigating more. Although this was the first episode that aired, it was not the first episode that was filmed. That was either The Case of the Moth-Eaten Mink or The Case of the Fan Dancer's Horse. We're still not sure why they used this one to kick the series off, but it's worth thinking about why. Why do you think this particular episode is a perfect opening for the series. Our Della this week is Sergeant Holcomb, a key character from the novels and particularly from this book, The Case of the Restless Redhead, who only appears in one other show. He appears in numerous novels and is sort of the precursor to Lieutenant Tragg before Earl Stanley Gardner came up with a better police antagonist for Mason. And so Sergeant Holcomb appears this week. He's adult just like he is in the books, but we're only going to see him one more time before he's gone from the series for good. And then finally, our Perry this week is the Ford Fairlane 500 Skyliner that Perry is rocking. And this is a 1957 automobile with a retractable hardtop roof. One of the fun things about Mason is the cars he drives, and it's a particularly nice one in this first episode. Let's transition now to the big theme, which is commitment, namely the lack of commitment between people and Perry's unwavering commitment to his clients when he believes they are innocent. If you made a world where every marriage was perfect, you would basically destroy the Mason universe. Helene Chaney, the Hollywood star, is getting married for the third time. Louis Bowles commits the murder to get the blackmail money because he wants to ditch his wife. And even in personal relationships, Perry's characters are flawed and lack commitment to one another. But then we have Perry. Perry goes into the office late, after office hours, to meet Bagby just because she was in need. He asks her if she committed the crime, and once he's satisfied that she's innocent, he puts his own legal standing on the line in order to upset the prosecution's case. Mason remains constant in his devotion to his secretary, Della, and private detective Paul, the only family he really has, as well as his clients. In a larger sense, what makes Mason so admirable is his commitment to justice. He not only makes sure his clients get off, he exonerates them by finding the murderer. It's worth discussing the whole switcheroo that Mason pulls with the guns in this episode because it's an element of the character, his willingness to toe the line of legality for his clients that's way more prevalent in the episodes based on the books than in the standalone TV episodes. And in this first season in particular, Mason will get close to crossing that line. In this episode, he finds out there are two exact duplicate weapons, and he suspects that the fiancé of Helene Chaney, Mervyn Aldrich, has swapped them or is trying to hide one of them in order to keep Helene from being a suspect. Perry brings Aldrich the gun that Bagby had given him, a gun that originally belonged to Aldrich. But what Mason does is add a file mark under its stub nose in order to be able to distinguish it from its twin. When Aldrich gives Perry back the gun, which he says is the same one, it doesn't have the file mark, and now Perry knows the game is afoot. Before returning to his office, Perry immediately goes to the crime scene, fires 2 bullets from the new gun, and when he later runs into Tragg, who wants the gun that Evelyn Bagby gave him, Mason complies, but not with the original gun from Bagby, but the duplicate. And this allows Mason to pull a misdirection move in court that will confuse the ballistics expert as well as Hamilton Berger. And with that confusion, Mason is able to wrest control of the trial from the prosecutor, and it's a matter of time before he gets his man. Note, something that Mason likes to do is create enough confusion where he can get the prosecutor or judge to allow him to recall a witness whether it is the defense's case or not. So what's the big takeaway from this episode? Our Perry proverb this week comes from an exchange that he has with Mrs. Bowles, the murderer's wife, as he's investigating the crime.
You have a master key for all the cabins, don't you, Mr. Bowles?
Well,
Of course we do. Any motel does.
Then, of course, you could enter any of the cabins.
Meaning what?
Meaning that either of you could have stolen Helene Chaney's jewelry and framed Evelyn Bagby.
Us? Why us?
Something I haven't worked out yet.
Something I haven't worked out yet. Mason knows to follow his hunches. And Mason may not know the why right now, but he typically knows the who. His conversation with Mrs. Bowles shows he already has his eyes set on the right family, and when he gets Louis Bowles to confess on the stand, he's got his man. He'll successfully locate over 260 more who's over this television run, and he'll keep working. That's the Perry principle until he understands the why. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks so much for joining me for this first voyage on the Perry Pod. Until next time, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep walking that Park Avenue beat.